Welcome, listener, to another deep dive. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources today. We're focusing specifically on different ways people approach something pretty central in faith and mission, church planting. We're digging into some excerpts from a document called Five Apostolic Church Planters. And it's interesting because it doesn't just talk about how you start churches, but it really gets into how the actual role of the planter changes, depending on what the end goal is.
That's exactly right. The source lays out three main types. You've got the pastoral church planter, the catalytic one, and then the apostolic church planter.
Okay.
And our mission here really is to unpack those distinctions. What are their goals, their methods, what are the strengths, the weaknesses? And importantly, why does this document argue pretty strongly that one of these approaches is, well, particularly effective for launching movements that can sustain themselves and keep reproducing?
So what's in it for you listening? Well, whether you're directly involved in this kind of work, or maybe you're just interested in different ways organizations work, different leadership styles, how goals really shape the methods you choose.
Yeah.
There are some, I think, pretty surprising insights here, maybe a few aha moments about things like leadership, delegation, thinking long-term versus just short-term results.
And what's really fascinating, I find, is how deeply the planter's own understanding of their job impacts the kind of church that gets planted.
Right.
And its potential, for future growth, for multiplication. It really pushes back against some common assumptions, particularly ones maybe more common in, say, Western contexts.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that.
Yeah.
We'll see how the sources use historical examples. Think the Apostle Paul and his team, like Barnabas, Apollos, Titus, people who were pioneering but often moved on. And then also more modern examples. Names like Rick Warren, Bob Roberts, Tom Steffen, George Patterson come up. We'll even look at some case studies the text mentions from places like Venezuela and India.
And it boils down to a pretty important question right from the outset, doesn't it? Could it be that changing the planter's main role, shifting from being the long-term pastor to more of a temporary equipper, could that be the key to unlocking, much greater potential for a whole movement?
That's the core question. Let's dive in and unpack this source material together.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's dive in. The source kicks things off by suggesting that if your real goal isn't just a church, but launching a sustainable reproducing movement of churches, well, then you need a different approach.
Right.
One that involves a pretty fundamental shift in how the planter sees their own job, moving towards what this document calls apostolic church planting.
Yeah, and it's crucial to understand how they're using that term apostle here. It's not strictly about the original 12 disciples or Paul's sort of unique calling.
Okay.
It's used more broadly, reflecting how the New Testament sometimes uses it for Paul's coworkers, those itinerant folks who went into new areas, but didn't necessarily settle down permanently with the churches they helped start.
Got it. So apostolic church planting, in this context, it's really about embracing that model.
Exactly.
From day one, your focus is intense, developing, empowering, releasing local believers to lead. The planter's role is deliberately temporary. The whole idea is planting in a way that actively resists creating dependency on the planter or, outside resources.
Precisely. And the source actually maps out these three distinct types of church planters. Each one represents a different approach, right? They have different primary goals. They focus their energy differently, face different challenges. They're suited for different contexts. And this is key. They have a really different impact on whether that church is likely to reproduce itself.
Okay, let's break those down. Let's start with the first one, the pastoral church planter. The source says this is probably the model most of us are familiar with, especially maybe in Western settings.
Yeah, that sounds right. Their main goal is pretty straightforward. Plant a new church and then stick around to pastor that church.
Okay.
If it's a cross-cultural situation, a missionary planter, the hope is often, I'll stay as pastor until we can train up a local leader who can take over the paid position.
And the method follows that goal, right? You start with evangelism, gather a core group. But once you have that group, the planter's energy shifts pretty heavily towards pastoral care. Preaching, teaching, counseling, discipleship, all the things involved in nurturing that specific congregation. If it's a team planting, they often function like a staff in an established church.
Yeah.
And the lead planter usually stays for the long haul.
And the source makes a really important point here. Most people getting into church planting, missionaries included, often aren't even aware that other ways exist. Think about it. Seminaries mostly train pastors, right? Not necessarily specialists in planting for multiplication. And a lot of the books, the denominational structures, they just assume this pastoral model. So naturally, the new church members come to expect the planter to be their pastor.
That makes total sense. If you're trained for pastoral ministry, often supported financially to do just that, it's natural to carry that load. And it's natural for the congregation to rely on you.
Right.
The strengths listed for this model are definitely real. It can provide strong, expert pastoral care.
Yeah.
You build deep, long-term relationships within that church. You get solid teaching.
Yes, absolutely. And the source does note this model can work well, but under specific conditions. Places where there's high potential for growth, either through lots of conversions or people transferring in.
Okay.
Where there's enough local wealth for the church to eventually support a paid pastor, and where you actually have trained local believers fairly readily available to potentially take over. The source suggests these conditions are often found in North America, which might explain why the model is so common and has seen some success there.
And this is where it gets really crucial for the discussion in this song. The source argues that those conditions are often missing in many parts of the world where cross-cultural or pioneer planting is happening now. If growth is slow, if the new believers are poor, if local resources are just scarce, that new church simply can't easily afford to pay a replacement pastor.
And the longer that founding planter stays on as the main pastor, the deeper that dependency becomes. You hear stories of missionaries staying 10, 20 years, sort of stuck, hoping for this financially viable local pastor who just never quite materializes. It leads to frustration.
Yeah.
And the only solution seems to be, well, maybe the mission subsidizes a local pastor, but that just reinforces the outside dependency, doesn't it?
Right. And true multiplication, where this church then plants its own daughter churches, which then plant more churches, that becomes really difficult, often rare, actually, with this pastoral model. George Patterson is quoted warning about this. He says, if you quickly start regular services led by an outside missionary, you risk just establishing what he calls preaching points. They look like churches, but they perpetuate dependency instead of becoming self-sustaining, reproducing bodies.
And what's fascinating is the underlying belief, often unconscious, that drives this model. This idea that a church isn't really established until it has a fully paid, professionally trained pastor running things.
Yeah.
The source directly challenges that. It points out, hey, a paid pastor isn't actually a biblical requirement for a church to function or even be healthy. Many dynamic movements, historically and today, have been laid. They completely bypass that whole how do we pay a pastor problem.
And because the pastoral planter is operating with that expectation, eventually a professional pastor will take over, they often invest maybe minimal energy in intentionally training and empowering lay people for actual pastoral roles from the get-go, leading groups, teaching, counseling.
Right. Believers in these churches can become, as the source puts it, a bit spoiled by having a full-time professional doing everything.
Oh. Yeah.
It sets a standard that's really hard for local leaders to meet, and it can foster this feeling of inadequacy among the lay people, like, oh, I could never do what Pastor Brooke does.
Yeah.
And this whole mindset that a church needs this highly trained, paid professional, the source identifies it as a major roadblock to planting and multiplication in many, many parts of the world. It ties up outside money, it creates dependency, and it instills this professional attitude towards ministry that actually holds back mobilizing the vast majority of local lay believers.
Okay, so if staying in pastoring creates dependency and kind of hinders multiplication, how does the second type, the catalytic church planter, approach it differently?
Right, the catalytic model. Think of a catalyst in chemistry. It speeds up or starts a reaction that's already possible.
Okay.
So the catalytic planter doesn't necessarily stay as the pastor of the very first church forever, but they often do stay in the region, acting as a resource person. Their goal is to launch a movement from that initial church base.
Ah, okay. So their energy, after planting that first one, shifts significantly towards facilitating reproduction.
Exactly. They're not satisfied with just one church. They want that first church to become a hub that plants others. Their focus becomes equipping, motivating, releasing workers from that first church to go out and start daughter churches.
So the key assumption there is that if you plant a strong initial church, strategically located, with the right kind of leadership, it can multiply daughter churches from that base.
Yes, and this approach is seen as pretty well suited for, say, moderately responsive urban areas where you have the potential for multiple plants to spring out from a central point.
The strengths seem clear.
Yeah.
You've got potential for actually facilitating church reproduction, building networks between the new churches, maintaining a long-term relationship with the whole effort in that region.
The source mentions models like mother-daughter churches or even multi-site churches, kind of fitting under this umbrella.
Okay.
But, and this is important, it fundamentally requires catalytic leadership. You need someone with the vision, the drive, the ability to constantly push that church beyond itself to reproduce.
Right.
The source acknowledges that ideally local leaders should provide this, but sometimes an exceptionally gifted outsider, the planter, can play this catalytic role effectively.
This sounds like where we see examples like Rick Warren and Saddleback.
Yeah.
Intentionally planting many churches under that overarching leadership and vision.
Exactly. Or Ron Sylvia at the church at the Springs. Or Bob Roberts Jr. at Northwood Church, the source mentions. Northwood reportedly facilitated planting something like 100 churches by training planters within that mother church.
Wow.
And there's the Venezuela case study with Francisco Lievino. He planted 5 churches in 5 years, and his initial church actually grew alongside that planting effort. He didn't wait until he had a megachurch. His catalytic leadership launched daughter churches, even from a relatively modest base.
Interesting.
The source also mentions a slight variation, where the planter doesn't pastor any local church directly, but focuses entirely on training and coaching other local planters, launching movements through these training hubs.
But what's the weakness here? The source points out it can be really heavily dependent on the exceptional gifts of that one catalytic leader. Right?
That's the main risk. The planter might overestimate their own ability, maybe invest really heavily in building up that one church, and then fail to actually see the reproduction happen. The whole movement can become very reliant on this specific gifted individual.
And the momentum might just slow down or stop when they leave.
Precisely. And here's a really critical distinction the source highlights. While this model reproduces at plants' daughter churches, it seldom achieves true multiplication.
Oh, okay. Reproduce versus multiply. What's the difference?
True multiplication is when the daughter churches then go on to plant their own daughter churches, and those plant churches, and so on. It's a chain reaction.
Got it.
The catalytic model often relies on the continued energy and vision flowing from the mother church or from that initial leader. It doesn't always empower the ordinary leaders in the daughter churches to reproduce themselves independently.
That is a key difference then. Reproduction happens from the center out, but multiplication needs to happen more organically from the edges.
You got it.
Which brings us logically to the third type, the apostolic church planter. The source argues this one is fundamentally different and, well, most often blessed for launching movements that are truly sustainable and multiplying.
Yes. Their goal is explicitly multiplication from the start. To plant churches that are not dependent on the planter or outside resources churches that contain the DNA, if you will, to reproduce themselves independently.
And the method is the radical part, isn't it? The planter acts as an equipper, a mobilizer, but not as a long-term pastor.
Correct. They focus intensely on training and delegating ministry functions to local people right from the absolute beginning. And they plan to move on relatively quickly, leaving the ongoing ministry entirely in local hands. Their role in any specific local church is deliberately temporary.
And this is presented as following the pattern of the Apostle Paul.
Right. According to the source, Paul never really settled down to pastor a church he planted. After the initial evangelism and gathering believers, his focus shifted primarily to empowering laypersons to carry on and expand the work. His ministry was itinerant, always pushing to new frontiers, aiming to establish churches with indigenous leaders who could then reproduce the work after he left.
And crucially, dependencies were just avoided from the outset. With this model, that whole problem of who's going to replace the church planter pastor, it just never even comes up.
Because they never become the pastor in the first place.
Right.
There's a fundamental trust that local believers are capable of leading if they're equipped from day one.
This isn't a brand new idea either, is it? The source mentions historical roots.
No, not at all. People like Henry Venn back in 1851, with his 3 self-propagating, self-governing, self-supporting churches, he argued strongly that missionaries shouldn't become pastors because it created the wrong models and pulled them away from their real pioneering task.
Yeah.
And Roland Allen's influential book from 1927 also highlighted Paul's itinerant, empowering approach. It's been around.
Glenn Kindle provides a great illustration in the source, comparing 2 fictional missionaries, Bob and Jeff.
Ah, yes, that's a good one. He describes Bob, who pastored a small church for 15 years, did most of the ministry himself because, he felt his people weren't trained enough. And maybe, Kendall hints, Bob wasn't too eager to give up control either.
Right. And then there's Jeff. He worked only 4 years in the same city, but facilitated starting 2 churches and was already working on a third.
Big difference.
Totally. Jeff focused on motivating and training people. He wasn't always the person out front. He developed leaders from the very beginning and wouldn't even start regular services until local leaders were ready and willing to lead them.
And Kendall points out that Jeff's ministry expanded because he drew out leaders, while Bob's ministry just sort of dragged on because his whole philosophy assumed it would take years, maybe decades, before local leaders would be ready.
The source labels Bob a pastoral planter and Jeff an apostolic planter. And the argument is that multiplication is tied more to the planter's philosophy and intentional methods that promote it, rather than just how responsive the people are in a given area.
And here's a particularly insightful point Kendall makes. He suggests apostolic planters might even benefit from working in 2 or 3 different geographical areas at the same time.
Really? How does that work?
Well, it sounds challenging, but this intentional distance forces the planter to be absent sometimes, and that, counterintuitively, reduces dependency. It creates the necessary space for local leaders to actually step up and grow into their roles.
So it prevents the planter from becoming the indispensable kingpin who might inadvertently, strangle the emerging local leadership.
Exactly. Tent makers, people with other jobs who can't be full-time with the church, sometimes have a built-in advantage here because they can't do everything.
That makes sense. David Garrison reinforces this too, right?
Yeah.
Noting that missionaries in the most effective church planting movements practice intense self-discipline. They mentor local planters rather than doing the planting themselves.
Yes. Rapidly growing movements prioritize training and empowering local lay leaders above almost everything else. Garrison suggests outsiders should keep a low profile, mentoring new believers and leaders more behind the scenes. Responsibility for the work gets intentionally shared from the very earliest stages.
So the planter models, then assists, then watches the local believers do it themselves, constantly passing on expertise.
Garrison even proposes that practical framework for on-the-job training. MAWL.
Oh, well.
Model, assist, watch, and leave.
Okay.
The apostolic planter models ministry, but always with the explicit goal of equipping others alongside them. They never take long-term personal responsibility for running things. This kind of practical in-service training, often happening outside formal institutions, is presented as absolutely key to rapid reproduction.
That India case study sounds like a powerful example of this shift.
It really is. An indigenous mission in Uttar Pradesh initially used what they called the old missionary model, basically the pastoral planter approach for 10 years. They had about 700 believers across 10 different fields.
Okay, 10 years, 700 believers.
Then, in 2002, they made a conscious decision to shift to a more apostolic model.
And what did that look like practically?
With the new strategy, the planters' goal for the year became plant new fellowships in 10 villages, train a local leader for each one, and then, crucially, hand over responsibility and move on to 10 new villages the next year. Equipping lay leaders became the absolute central focus.
Wow. And the result?
The result. Within just 1 year of adopting this intentional strategy change, the number of fellowships doubled from 65 to 130. The number of believers grew to 1,500.
So they more than doubled the results of the previous 10 years in just 12 months.
Exactly. Simply through that intentional shift in the planter's role and focus, it's pretty dramatic.
That's incredible. George Patterson, who you mentioned earlier, he saw similar things in Honduras, right?
Well,
The movement of 100 house churches.
Yes. Using methods like theological education by extension, basically bringing training to leaders where they are, often while they're already doing ministry and lots of in-service training. He developed well-known equipping tools like Train and Multiply, based directly on these apostolic principles.
And Paul Gupta, launching a movement in India, argued vehemently that an outside missionary should never become the pastor among unreached people groups.
Right. The missionary's role, he argued, is purely as a catalyst to initiate the movement. Identify gifts and potential in new believers right from the start, and then focus relentlessly on equipping them to do the work.
Which means a planter has to be willing to surrender that desire to be the one up front.
Absolutely. If you love to preach, you have to learn to equip others to preach. If you're gifted in counseling, you shift your energy to empowering local believers to counsel each other.
The source acknowledges the lay sermons might not be as polished initially. Maybe the counseling isn't as professional.
Sure. But the long-term reward is empowered local leaders who own the church and can carry it on long after the planter has moved on. The missionary is constantly working themselves out of a job.
Performing ministry only as long as it takes to train a local believer to do it.
And the source even suggests, maybe controversially, that ideally, if a local person isn't willing and able to be trained for a particular ministry function, maybe that ministry shouldn't even be started by the planter.
Because it won't be sustainable locally.
Exactly. This might make for a slower start in terms of visible activity, maybe fewer programs initially, but the result, the argument goes, is a much more solid, self-sustaining movement in the long run.
The Craig case study illustrates this perfectly. Remember that one? A small new church plant in Eastern Europe needed another preacher for their weekly services.
Right, and the missionary couldn't preach more than twice a month because of language and cultural background limitations.
So the initial conventional thought was, okay, we need to ask the mission agency to send another missionary preacher. Standard pastoral or maybe catalytic thinking?
But when they brainstormed based on this apostolic philosophy, a different path emerged. Several lay leaders said they were willing to preach if the missionary would assist them in preparing their messages.
So the solution wasn't bringing in outside resources, it was about equipping locals.
Precisely. Which guarded against dependency and actively promoted lay mobilization and local ownership.
Now, this apostolic model isn't presented as easy. It has its challenges.
Definitely not easy. The planter might need to change locations frequently, which can be tough on families, hard for building really deep personal relationships in one place.
And few planters are actually trained this way, are they?
Very few. And it requires a real willingness to consciously restrain your own ministry gifts. You have to potentially accept things being done, let's say, less perfectly in the short term for the sake of developing those local leaders long term.
What about resistant areas?
That's a real challenge. In highly resistant areas, local believers might be genuinely unwilling or feel incapable of leadership, at least initially. Or where new believers are illiterate or come from vastly different worldviews, developing capable leaders and self-sustaining churches can be a very long, tedious process.
Even Paul faced difficulties, right? The source acknowledges issues in places like Corinth after he left, even using his approach.
True, it's not a magic bullet. But the source strongly argues that despite these challenges, this is the fundamental approach Paul used, and it's the one that has consistently been employed in most of the rapidly expanding movements we see in responsive areas throughout history. The ultimate concern isn't just speed in starting something, but implementing locally reproducible methods that lead to self-sustaining, multiplying movements over the long haul.
Okay, so reflecting on all three types, pastoral, catalytic, and apostolic, which model is presented as best?
Well, the source is careful. It says God can certainly use any model. But determining the most appropriate model for a given situation involves looking at biblical principles and your ultimate goals, things like spiritual health, the potential for multiplication, indigenization, local ownership, and good stewardship of resources.
So the pastoral model works best, the source concludes, where?
In those moderately to highly responsive, generally affluent settings where professionally trained local pastors are realistically available to take over.
And the catalytic model.
That seems best suited for urban areas where there's clear potential for mother-daughter type planting, but it really requires a planter with truly exceptional vision and gifting for mobilization, that special catalytic leader.
Okay, and the apostolic.
The apostolic model, well, maybe the most personally challenging for the planter needing that constant self-denial. That intentional phase-out is presented as the most versatile. It can work in urban or rural settings, affluent or poor.
And crucially,
it's the one the source argues God has most consistently and greatly blessed for launching rapid, multiplying movements over time. But it does require patience and a willingness to fundamentally rethink maybe more traditional training methods.
yeah, that point about initial visible growth potentially seeming slower makes sense. You're heavily reliant on empowering local lay leaders who might be untrained at the start.
Right. But the long-term promise is much more rapid and sustainable reproduction and multiplication, precisely because the whole process becomes far less dependent on specific outside individuals or professional planters.
Tom Stephan's emphasis on intentional phase-out seems key here. It's not just about leaving eventually, but actively working towards leaving from day one.
Exactly. So you don't impede local development. You actually speed up the overall movement process by getting out of the way at the right times.
Are there other potential difficulties mentioned for the apostolic model?
Yeah, a couple. Navigating highly educated populations who might have strong expectations for professionally credentialed pastors can be tricky, and there's always the potential risk of poor teaching or even false teaching creeping in if local leaders aren't adequately discipled and equipped over time.
Which highlights the need for that wise, ongoing, perhaps itinerant equipping and mentoring, like Apollo's watering what Paul planted.
Precisely. It's not just plant and abandon, it's plant and empower, then support from an appropriate distance.
Ultimately, then, the source stresses that for any approach, the planter and the team need to be aware of the different options, right? They need to unify on a model that fits their specific context and goals.
Yes, and then consistently and intentionally implement it, acknowledging both the strengths and the weaknesses of that choice. But the effectiveness, particularly for multiplication, seems to largely hinge on the planter's willingness to adapt their own role, moving away from being the central, permanent figure.
The source offers some helpful biblical distinctions to clarify these roles too, doesn't it? Like Paul in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 3:6, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it. It clearly shows a distinction between that pioneering work of establishing something new, planting, and the strengthening work of nurturing what's already there, watering.
And both important.
Absolutely. And interestingly, both Paul and Apollos were itinerant figures in that specific passage, but there's a functional difference being highlighted.
And we see Paul and Barnabas consistently appointing elders in the churches they planted before they moved on. Acts 14:23. Deliberately entrusting the ongoing care to local leaders.
Right. And when Paul left Ephesus, Acts 20, he committed the local elders to God's care, knowing they would remain to shepherd the flock. The missionary team moved on, the local elders stayed. Titus 1.5 even suggests the work wasn't fully finished or set in order until elders were appointed locally.
And the role of those elders is consistently described as shepherds, overseers focused on spiritual care, teaching, leadership within that congregation.
And Ephesians 4.11 lists different gifts or roles: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. The term apostle itself literally means one who is sent, highlighting that itinerant, sent-out nature, whereas pastor and teacher are roles more directly linked to the elders who remain with the flock.
So there's a clear pattern emerging. Planters, like apostles, missionaries tend to be itinerant. They pioneer new areas, start the work, evangelize, disciple, equip local leaders, appoint elders, and move on.
And waterers, like pastors, elders remain with the flock. They strengthen, nurture, grow, teach, counsel, provide that ongoing care for the believers in that specific place.
Now, these aren't totally rigid boxes, right? Paul was mainly apostolic, but obviously nurtured believers deeply.
Of course, there's overlap. But the key distinction and the heart of the apostolic planter model is having that unwavering eye on departure, focusing intensely on equipping the local people who will remain, and actively identifying and recruiting future local planters from within. Their primary passion isn't settling down as a pastor, it's pioneering new regions and unleashing local multiplication.
And that focus leads right into this idea of the intentional, evolving role of the apostolic planter. The goal is truly equipping local believers not just to be the church, but to lead it and eventually become the next generation of planters themselves.
Exactly. And Tom Steffen's phase-out approach, which you mentioned from his book Passing the Baton, gives a really practical model for this.
Yeah, tell us more about that.
From the very beginning, the planter structures everything they do, their activities, their interactions, specifically to work themselves out of a job by empowering local leaders to take over step by step.
He noticed his mission was struggling, partly because planters saw themselves as long-term pastors.
Right. And crucially, they were training local believers merely to assist them, rather than training them to fully take over. There is this underlying assumption, maybe unconscious, that local nationals needed years, decades even, of missionary presence before they could possibly lead or plant independently.
So Steffen's model proposes a series of changing roles for the planter.
Yes, designed to quickly propel national leaders into ministry. He lays out 5 stages, moving the planter from being a learner themselves initially to becoming an evangelist, then a teacher, then a resident advisor, then an itinerant advisor, and finally, just an absent advisor. The whole team understands their task is explicitly temporary.
The source offers a similar framework, maybe even more memorable, the 6M approach.
Ah, yes, the 6 M's. Progressing from motor to model, mobilizer, mentor, multiplier, and finally just a memory.
Okay, walk us through that. Motor.
In a brand new pioneer situation, the planter often has to be the motor, providing that initial energy, getting things going when nothing else is happening.
Makes sense. Then model.
As new believers emerge, the planter shifts to being a model, demonstrating ministry, but in ways that are deliberately reproducible, things local people can actually see themselves doing, not fancy, unrepeatable stuff.
Then mobilizer.
Mobilizer is about inspiring and calling those new believers into discipleship, into service, into taking ownership of the work, helping them sense God's calling on their lives.
Next is mentor.
Right. This is where the intentional equipping happens on the job, training local believers for essential ministries, while the planter gradually takes more of a background advisory role.
What are the dangers here?
The dangers, the source notes, are doing too much for too long, pushing ahead before the locals have really taken ownership, or maybe setting standards so high they feel completely unachievable given local capacity or resources.
Okay. After mentor comes multiplier.
Yes, this is a key shift. The multiplier stage is where the planter focuses on equipping local believers not just to do ministry, but to become equippers of others, coaching them as they plant the first daughter church. At this point, the missionaries should really no longer be doing primary frontline ministry themselves.
And the danger here?
The danger is the missionary remaining the real leader behind the scenes, sort of pulling the strings even after locals are doing the visible work, still fostering dependency, just more subtly.
And finally, memory.
Memory. Having successfully reproduced themselves in local believers who can now lead and reproduce the work, the missionary intentionally departs. This might mean moving to a completely new, unreached location, ideally taking a national trainee with them to model the process again. Or perhaps becoming a regional coach, supporting multiple movements from a distance.
And the danger here is obvious.
Simply staying too long. Overstaying your welcome, even with good intentions, and inadvertently hindering the very movement you helped start.
The source observes that while most planters might agree with this kind of phase-out idea in theory,
Yeah, the difficulty comes in practice, especially when local believers seem slow or hesitant to take responsibility. It's easy for the planter to get impatient and think, it'll just be faster and better if I do it myself for now. They'll catch up eventually.
but the exact opposite often happens, doesn't it?
Exactly. The locals become more dependent, not less. They can feel inadequate seeing the expert always doing everything perfectly, and they learn implicitly that if they just wait, the missionary will eventually step in and take care of it. The church ends up being seen as the missionary's project, not really their church.
So, wrapping this section up, while acknowledging the pastoral and catalytic models exist and God uses them in certain contexts,
Yes.
the apostolic model, with its intense focus on equipping locals and that intentional departure, is really presented by the source as the approach most likely to facilitate genuine multiplication,
Yeah.
especially in pioneer settings where resources are limited and unleashing local capacity is paramount.
It requires that deep commitment to developing, empowering, and then quickly releasing local believers to evangelize, disciple, lead, and plant churches all themselves.
Wow, that was a really insightful deep dive into these different models of church planting from our source material. We've explored the pastoral model, often leading to dependency, the catalytic model,
Yeah.
which can foster reproduction, but sometimes struggles with that true organic multiplication, and then this apostolic approach.
And we've definitely seen how the document makes a really strong case for that apostolic model, the one centered on empowering local believers and intentionally moving on, arguing it's particularly suited for sustainable multiplication.
Yeah.
We looked at examples like Paul's on itinerant ministry and modern movements that really prioritize equipping lay leaders, not just professionals, and actively work to avoid financial or leadership dependency on outsiders. Concepts like Stefan's phase-out approach or that 6M progression.
Motor, model, mobilizer, mentor, multiplayer, memory.
Right. They really highlight this radical, intentional shift away from the planter needing to be the central, permanent figure.
It really is a counterintuitive reframing of success, isn't it? It stops being measured by how long you stay or how big your specific church gets.
Exactly.
And instead, it's measured by how effectively you equip others to continue and multiply the work totally independently after you're gone.
And this model, while, yeah, it's definitely challenging, it requires significant sacrifice from the planter, potentially slower visible starts while you're developing that local capacity. It's presented as the most versatile, the most historically proven, perhaps, and biblically aligned approach for launching genuinely self-sustaining movements, particularly in those resource-limited or cross-cultural contexts where the more traditional models often seem to falter or create long-term problems.
You know, it really makes you think about leadership more broadly, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Beyond just church planting.
How so?
Well, are the structures and processes we build maybe in any project, any organization, are they designed in a way that depends heavily on our specific skills, our presence, our personality?
Yeah.
Or are we consciously designing things from the very start with the explicit goal of empowering others, enabling them to take full ownership and eventually operate completely independently of us?
That's a great takeaway. And the source material makes that clear, helpful distinction between the roles. The pioneering planters, or apostles missionaries, their job is to initiate, move on to new frontiers. And then the waterers, or pastors elders, their job is to remain, to strengthen and mature the existing community.
Right. And while there's overlap.
There's overlap, of course, but recognizing those distinct priorities is presented as absolutely key to choosing the right strategy if your goal is multiplication.
So, listener, what does all this mean for you? Maybe consider this. If the long-term effectiveness and the multiplication potential of a movement, or maybe even just a project or a team, are fundamentally tied to the leader's willingness to make their own role temporary and to focus intensely on developing local or internal capacity right from day one, how might that principle challenge or inform your own approach? Whether it's leadership, mentoring, building anything in any area of your life, is your current approach building dependency, or is it intentionally fostering multiplication?
That's definitely something worth mulling over.